This is a young girl in her mid-30s who has lived this extraordinarily turbulent and difficult time in the public eye.
Got off the plane in Heathrow, called my mother, and one of the things I said to her was, I can't think who's going to give the eulogy, and I got an awful feeling it's going to have to be me.
A silence spanning multiple decades has just been broken by Earl Charles Spencer, sending shockwaves across the United Kingdom through the unveiling of a long-concealed truth about Camilla's history. This evidence vindicates the late Princess of Wales, proving her suspicions were grounded in reality rather than paranoia. She was the focus of a coordinated operation. For 29 years, the global community dismissed Diana's fears of surveillance as the tragic hallucinations of a failing marriage. However, hidden within the deep subterranean vaults of Althorp House, Charles has brought to light a physical file that directly implicates the current queen in a meticulous strategy of psychological subversion. What drove a palace sentry to gamble his entire career by presenting a mysterious chest to the mourning brother on the day of the funeral? Furthermore, what specific, damning directives did Camilla leave behind that were intended to remain buried forever? What dark secrets reside in these pages to make the crown shudder? And how will the populace respond now that the anxiety they were told to ignore stands exposed as a calculated trap? The dawn at Althorp arrived with an eerie, heavy stillness, the sort of quiet that actively oppresses the senses rather than merely lacking noise. Standing before the fortified iron-bound entrance of the lowest basement archive was Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl. Though he had bypassed this threshold thousands of times over the previous 29 years, his hand had never once turned the knob. On this specific day, he felt an agonizing compulsion that transcended mere inquisitiveness. Shifting the lantern over to his left hand, he watched its beam pierce the dusty, stagnant atmosphere. The sharp crunch of his boots against the stone floor reverberated with excessive volume, mimicking a solitary heartbeat within a vacant cavern. His mind drifted back to the funeral service, the suffocating weight of worldwide sorrow, and the predatory way broadcasting lenses devoured the family's torment. Amid that chaotic fog of dark garments and blinding strobes, an individual clad in the attire of a palace guard had thrust a heavy, unlabeled leather chest into his grasp. "For when the dust settles, my lord," the stranger had muttered before dissolving into the dense gathering before Charles could demand his identity. Charles arrived at the isolated archive corner, where the chest rested, appearing far smaller than it had lived in his memories, a solitary monument to a prematurely ended life. Dropping to his knees despite the protest of the freezing stone, his hands hung momentarily above the corroded brass clasps. His thoughts turned to Diana, recalling the warmth of her laughter, which invariably ignited in her gaze prior to reaching her mouth. He then visualized her diminished state during her final chapters, a mere ghost of herself who constantly scanned her surroundings, utterly certain that the very masonry of Kensington Palace was eavesdropping. Gripping the fastener, Charles recollected a final exchange shared with Diana mere weeks ahead of the fatal crash. She had offered him a silver fountain pen, her fingers pale from the intensity of her grip, warning him that if anything should happen, he must seek out the items intentionally hidden from sight. Lacking comprehension back then, he understood fully now as he forced the latch, which surrendered with a piercing scream of warped iron. Beneath several layers of decayed wool coverings inside lay the heavy mahogany container, possessing a weight far greater than its dimensions suggested. A dark, threatening wax seal remained undisturbed until he fractured it with his thumbnail, causing the fragments to flake away like dried, encrusted blood. Resting within the crushed velvet interior was a financial register, a magnetic audio tape, and a packet of correspondence bound by a dark ribbon. The moment he extracted the initial page, his breathing ceased. The elegant, tilted penmanship was instantly recognizable from the countless official galas of his past. The signature inscribed at the base read Camilla, causing Charles to feel the room spin on its axis as he sank back, the subterranean chill penetrating his frame. The quiet of the cellar transformed instantly into something lethal. He was no longer holding mere stationery, but a volatile explosive capable of shattering the royal institution. As the master of Althorp, his position was anchored in hundreds of years of noble heritage, yet that immense wealth and ancestry felt like a brittle veneer. His entire existence had been dedicated to safeguarding a lineage, yet here lay the naked truth regarding the woman who populated the backdrop of his youth, the figure whose shadow pursued his sister until her final breath. The morning atmosphere at Althorp grew sharp and metallic, delivering a frost that penetrated Charles's heavy wool knit as he carefully relocated the mahogany container up to the estate library. This sanctuary of immense privilege, lined with leather-clad premier editions and portraits of royal-serving patriarchs, suddenly mirrored a confinement cell. Believing he could not even rely on his most faithful manservant among the staff, and fully aware that his estate's bedrock rested on histories the monarchy preferred to omit, he required an outsider. He sought an individual detached from the ruling class who viewed reality strictly through undeniable verification. Utilizing his encrypted satellite device, he punched in a sequence unused for years, prompting Arthur Pendleton to pick up on the second alert with a voice resembling ancient parchment. "Charles, a significant duration has passed since you last pursued a ghost," remarked the retired intelligence analyst. Waiving all formalities, Charles responded, "I possess an item demanding the scrutiny of the solitary individual I believe in, Arthur. It originates from 1989, and it concerns her." A prolonged, tense silence stretched across the line, the specific type shared exclusively by operatives who understand the crushing load of classified truths. Arthur identified the subject instantly, having privately scrutinized the contradictions within the Paris disaster security briefings before being ordered by administration to incinerate his findings. He had existed in voluntary isolation within a secluded Cotswolds cabin ever since, choosing his moral integrity over his profession. "My arrival will be prior to midnight," Arthur murmured in a subdued tone, adding, "But Charles, if these materials match my suspicions, this transcends a mere palace scandal. This signifies open warfare." Upon terminating the connection, Charles gazed through the glass pane at the vast, mist-shrouded terrain outside. He envisioned the summer season of 1988, recalling Diana at an outdoor celebration, with her countenance radiating a fragile optimism that her matrimony might survive. Simultaneously, under a nearby oak tree's canopy stood Camilla, observing Diana with an intense, almost predatory fixation that felt entirely unnatural at the time. Though Charles had brushed it aside as standard court animosity back then, the recollection struck him now with physical brutality, especially the image of Camilla murmuring to a gentleman in a gray ensemble. The features of that individual now dissolved in Charles's memory like an unidentifiable phantom. He walked the perimeter of the library, his steps silenced by the dense weave of Persian carpets, while every strike of the pendulum clock sounded like a ticking explosive. Despite his vast entitlements and noble rank, he felt reduced to a mere token in a contest rigged long before his birth. The immense fortune of Althorpe offered no sanctuary now, merely transforming him into a grander objective for those determined to keep history entombed in the quiet earth. Arthur reached the grounds of Althorpe under the concealment of a moonless night, moving as silently and discreetly as the low mist hovering over the sculpted shrubbery. Constructed of sharp physical angles and even sharper perceptions, he wore a garment dating back several decades and gripped a worn, heavy satchel holding more classifications than typical state archives. Meeting him at the staff entrance with a taut expression, Charles led the way through the winding hallways without a word, their movements reverberating against the marble like rhythmic percussion. Illumination in the library came solely from a solitary desktop bulb, transforming the space into a reinforced bunker. Setting his container down, Arthur donned delicate surgical gloves with unwavering control before stepping toward the mahogany box as though approaching an unexploded device. "A great deal of time has rolled by since we occupied the same side of reality, Charles," Arthur muttered softly. "You always functioned as the one eager to trust the integrity of the establishment." Leaning against the dark wood desk with a rigid frame, Charles kept his eyes fixed on the analyst's hands, replying hoarsely, "My actions were foolish. I spent my existence honoring a lineage anchored in corruption." Offering no reply, Arthur concentrated entirely on the register, sweeping his magnification lens across the text. His professional life as an MI6 document specialist had trained him to detect the imperceptible, the minor oscillation in a signature, or the chemical composition of vintage inks. He recognized that wealthy dynasties of the 80s utilized custom-ordered Swiss iron gall formulations for their private documents, leaving a unique deep indigo trail that progressively eroded the stationery. His forehead creased during the inspection, a flash of genuine astonishment altering his features. "This transcends a standard ledger of estate outlays, Charles. This represents a covert payroll," Arthur whispered, indicating a sequence of digits documenting funds transferred to an intelligence entity known as the Kensington Group. Arthur's thoughts raced back to his operational era, remembering muted hallway discussions concerning an unauthorized branch of royal protection, answering only to a restricted inner circle. Though he had long suspected this operation, definitive proof had eluded him until this exact second. Pulling a crisp, high-grade page from the collection, he read the biting text demanding immediate breakthroughs regarding the Diana Initiative. This reading brought back the memory of Camilla's laughter, a sharp, joyless sound that consistently tracked Diana like a dark storm cloud hovering over a summer landscape. He recalled how palace retainers would scatter whenever Camilla appeared, driven not by deference, but by an overt, freezing terror. Charles felt the crushing weight of his past blindness. He had observed his sister diminish, received her panicked nocturnal admissions of being trailed, and merely instructed her to remain resilient. He recognized now that he had been directing her to endure a conflagration quietly fueled by the very woman forced upon her as a nemesis. Prior to Charles comprehending the full scope of the financial ledger, the massive oak entrance of the library shuddered against its casing, rattling as though pressured by an unyielding invisible force. Swiftly slipping the register beneath a pile of ordinary property tax records with practiced agility, Arthur watched Charles cut the power to the lamp. The environment instantly dissolved into a stifling, pitch-black state, punctured exclusively by a sliver of lunar light cutting through the heavy velvet drapes. Standing completely paralyzed, they maintained shallow, measured breaths while absorbing the stillness of Althorpe. This was not the peaceful rest of an empty manor, but the coiled, calculated silence of a carnivore waiting for its target to falter. A silhouette glided past the frosted pane of the entry door, a shape completely alien to the resident domestic staff. It paused momentarily, casting a long, warped image across the floor before retreating silently into the dark corridor. Charles felt his ribs vibrate from the violent hammering of his heart, a raw physical manifestation of the vulnerability he had hidden his entire life. As the Earl and commander of this domain, he nevertheless felt as hollowed out as the historical legacy he was unearthing. His mind drifted back to early 90s London, remembering how phone connections would crackle with static before severing entirely an occurrence he once blamed on deteriorating lines, but now identified as the trademark of interception. He visualized Diana's massive, expressive eyes filled with an indescribable dread, begging him to perceive that her inner circle consisted of adversaries rather than allies. Having dismissed her fears as the fallout of an intense lifestyle, standing in this darkness forced him to confront his own role in her isolation. Though the corridor outside remained silent, the danger hung heavy in the air, manifesting as a freezing draft penetrating the ancient woodwork. Closing the distance, Arthur's voice existed as a mere acoustic frequency against Charles's ear. They recognize its absence, Charles. Their objective extends beyond the container. They must guarantee our permanent silence. This realization hit the Earl with immense force. The container ceased to be a mere collection of historical anomalies, transforming instead into a target that turned his sanctuary into a besieged outpost. Reaching toward his workspace, he unsealed a concealed drawer kept secured since his father's demise, extracting a compact, dark, disposable phone. He had set it up following the guidance of a retired police contact who warned him long ago that aristocratic fortresses were far less secure than the public assumed. Glancing at Arthur, whose face showed total defiance in the pale light, Charles breathed, "We remain inside this room. Any movement invites their attack. We will await the sunrise and subsequently deliver this material to the single location completely beyond their jurisdiction." Pressing the mahogany chest against his torso, its physical presence anchored him to the reality of the immense treachery he had finally brought to light. Daylight crept over Northamptonshire, not with a radiant illumination, but with a bruised, leaden sky that stripped the majesty from the rolling terrain of Althorpe. Neither Charles nor Arthur had found sleep, remaining anchored to the library by the sea of records strewn across the dark desk. While the immediate threat in the hallway had dissipated, the air remained dense with the suffocating reality of their discoveries. Arthur had utilized the final hours of darkness to cross-reference the financial logs with the private letters, his hands operating with automated, relentless precision. He had constructed a chronological chart covering nearly a decade, exposing a complex network of transactions and orders that corrupted the crown like a slow-acting toxin. Every financial movement represented a calculated phase in an operation designed to fracture a princess, converting her private residence into a surveillance mechanism where every action was monitored, logged, and turned against her. Arthur gestured toward a concluding ledger notation recorded a mere 2 weeks ahead of the Paris crash, marked by an enigmatic shorthand, K-Plan Final Extraction. The analyst's face appeared unusually drained of color as he recalled the press releases of that specific era, characterized by sudden escalations in Diana's unpredictable conduct and leaked narratives regarding her psychological fragility, dominating every tabloid layout. Having accepted those accounts back then alongside the rest of civilization, he now recognized those stories were not random disclosures, but calculated operations. Camilla had functioned as far more than a romantic adversary. She was the mastermind of a psychological siege. Examining the correspondence once more, Charles's gaze paused on a particular section where Camilla detailed a strategy to subvert the staff at Kensington, systematically swapping Diana's therapeutic prescriptions with ineffective placebos to ensure her emotional volatility was both public and unmanageable. The method was cold, methodical, and devastatingly successful. A wave of physical illness washed over Charles as he remembered standing beside his sister at public functions, watching her battle to maintain her dignity while entirely unaware that her mind was being systematically dismantled by the individual who now reigned as queen. The family fortune, the titles, the curated lineage, it all felt like an absolute travesty. He had spent his existence operating under the belief that nobility functioned as a shield, but he now perceived it as merely an alternative mask. Rising on stiff joints, he stepped to the expansive windows overlooking the grounds to see the groundskeeper starting his morning routine, oblivious that his employer held the instrument capable of vaporizing the established order. The helplessness experienced during the dark hours had crystallized into an absolute, unwavering resolve. No longer merely a grieving sibling, he was now the administrator of a truth withheld from humanity for far too long. Turning back to Arthur, who was carefully locking the files into a satchel, he knew the parameters had shifted. They were no longer defending against ghosts, but preparing to step into the light. The sun had climbed completely into the sky, yet the daylight offered no warmth to melt the ice gripping Charles's core. He required a distribution channel immune to judicial injunctions, a medium capable of bypassing the managed narratives of the domestic media. Looking toward Arthur, who was securing the satchel with a robust steel mechanism, Charles stated, "Our requirements extend beyond these documents. We must present the literal voice of the plot." He indicated the vintage magnetic tape resting within the velvet lining of the mahogany box. Arthur paused, his hand hanging over the audio equipment he had integrated into the library's premier sound network. If this recording matched their suspicions, an actual strategy meeting regarding the K-plan, it represented the final catastrophic component of the case. Arthur pressed the activation switch. The audio emerged grainy, saturated with the background clatter of a bustling, high-end London eatery dating back to 1989. Yet the dialogue penetrated the interference with terrifying precision. It was Camilla, issuing directives with a detached, freezing authority to a gentleman possessing a low, gravelly voice, presumably the director of the private intelligence operation. "The populace is volatile," her voice sounded above the ring of dining utensils. "They perceive a romance, whereas we recognize a catastrophe of her own creation. By persistently targeting the weak points, the intercepted communications, the misdirected mail, the hidden whispers, her collapse becomes unavoidable. She will orchestrate her own banishment." The color drained entirely from Charles's face. This transcended a conversation born of affection or resentment, revealing instead the calculated destruction of a human being. His mind flashed back to a weekend spent at Highgrove years prior, where he had caught fragments of Camilla discussing the management of Diana's public footprint, foolishly assuming back then she referred to media relations. He had failed to perceive it meant psychological warfare. The recording persisted for an additional 3 minutes, outlining specific tracking coordinates and identifying media figures on the corporate payroll designated to receive exclusive, unverified accounts regarding the princess's alleged mental decline. The sheer boldness of the act was paralyzing. They were not merely plotting, they were actively editing history as it unfolded. Gripping the tape with white-knuckled intensity, Charles recognized he possessed the ammunition to ignite a revolution, yet he simultaneously held the material to become the nation's most targeted individual. He observed the disposable phone resting on the wood surface. His entire existence had been governed by the protocols of the highborn, operating under the assumption that leadership shared a baseline of honor. He had been utterly mistaken. Seizing the device, he placed a call to the solitary media executive he knew would prioritize raw truth over royal allegiance, an international broadcasting contact who had anticipated a revelation of this magnitude for nearly 30 years. The era of concealment had reached its conclusion. Charles Spencer is seated beneath the unyielding intensity of broadcast illumination, his garments perfectly smooth, his countenance reflecting a calm, destructive determination. He has shed the persona of an earl adhering to the parameters of his social bracket, emerging as a man who has surrendered his ancestral birthright in pursuit of accountability. The director, a woman defined by a sharp, pragmatic focus, counts down from 5 using her fingers until the broadcast indicator shifts to an unwavering, intense crimson hue. The environment outside the studio instantly ceases to exist. Charles looks directly into the lens, his gaze carrying the full gravity of every hidden reality he has brought to light. For 29 years, he commences, his delivery steady, deep, and completely devoid of the vibration that plagued him in the shadows of Althorpe. The public was told that my sister's anxieties stemmed from an unstable psyche. We were conditioned with a narrative of delusion that protected the actual masterminds of her torment. Reaching within his jacket, he brings forth the premier handwritten document bearing the indigo signature that had dominated his thoughts, resting it on the surface as the lens focuses on the unmistakable tilt of the writing. Today, my presence here is not that of a sibling seeking pity. I stand here as an eyewitness to a deliberate, heavily financed operation of psychological warfare that was never intended for public view. He halts, permitting the quiet to linger in the room, a calculated pause that compels every viewer to lean forward in anticipation of the impact. Indicating the director, the background monitors illuminate with the digitized file of the covert financial ledger, rendering the phrase, K-Plan Final Extraction, perfectly legible to countless citizens. The reaction is instantaneous. Within the monitoring room, communication lines erupt into a rhythmic, turbulent storm of incoming alerts. Yet Charles remains detached from the chaos. He holds his gaze locked onto the lens, fully aware that across the nation, the truth is finally piercing the royal facade. Activating a control switch, the audio from the 1989 magnetic tape reverberates through the broadcast monitors, unleashing Camilla's voice, cold and methodical, outlining the demolition of a woman's existence. With the fading of the recording, the studio is enveloped in a profound, absolute quiet. The exposure is total. Charles recognizes that by the time he exits these facilities, society will be permanently transformed. Live feeds of the Buckingham Palace entryways show the space already filling with a massive gathering of quiet, sorrowful citizens clutching white roses. No shouting occurs, merely a deep, shared comprehension that the history they were given was a fabrication. Charles rises, his shadow stretching long and distinct across the facility floor. He has shattered the wall of concealment, fulfilling his sister's concluding request, and by doing so, he has left the structural bedrock of the monarchy in absolute ruins. The camera holds on his countenance as he changes direction to depart, his features projecting a hollowed-out tranquility, the burden finally removed, the truth finally liberated.